Two briefings are expected to take place later today to report on the findings of investigations into last year's July unrest in South Africa. The security cluster will focus on the progress of the implementation of recommendations made by that expert panel on Premier Sihle Zikalala. Will focus on the progress in rebuilding, especially where particular sites were damaged as a result of these riots. So let's reflect on some of the events that led to the unrest last year and where we are 1 year later. We're joined now by author and News 24 politics editor Qaanitah Hunter, who joins us via our video link. Qaanitah, it's great to talk to you, and incredible to think that it's been a year already. Of course, you perhaps have a unique perspective as someone who co-authored that book on the unrest called 8 Days in July. As you reflect 1 year later, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so, I mean, the most important thing is the political willingness to fix the system that allowed July to happen, and the warnings that has come from civil society, from opposition parties, and also from the President's report that he commissioned by Professor Sihle Afrika, that if something is not done drastically, that South Africa is at risk for another sort of unrest or manifestations of this type of unrest to happen again. And so I think a year later, there's a lot of apprehension, there's a lot of jitteriness around whether this could manifest itself again. The same people who threatened and intimidated people and incited violence last year are doing the same now. And there's not much accountability. News 24 is reporting this morning, only 3 people have been arrested with murders, despite the fact that over 350 people died last year. We look at the economic situation, and you said Premier Sihle Zikalala is going to report back on that. But how much of the complicity of the state led to over 50 billion rand being wiped off the economy? These are the things that people still have questions about 1 year later.
Yeah, I mean, part of what that expert panel recommended in the wake of those 8 days in July is that Cabinet must take full responsibility of what happened. So two parts to my question. What does that mean? And then the other big recommendations from that panel is that the President must initiate the drawing up of a national security strategy. How far are we there?
So the Cabinet taking responsibility, we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa in the State of the Nation address earlier this year saying just that. Cabinet takes responsibility. He does not does not explain what does that mean, what it means in terms of consequences, but it was empty words. And I mean, that's a very serious finding by Professor Sihle Afrika, that our Cabinet, the heads of the executive arm of the state, were culpable in some way for allowing what happened. We know the findings made around Beki Cele, for example, and the fact that he had ongoing spats with the then police commissioner Qaanitah Hunter. Now, the finding around the national security strategy, we heard yesterday. I had spoken to Dr. Sidney Mufamadi, who's now the President's security advisor, and he says he's initiating this process. A draft will be presented to Parliament, and the public will be able to make comment. He is asserting, and so is the President, that they want the public to own this process and this document as a way to, we all agree what this looks like. What does a national security strategy mean for the country in determining, what happens and how much power the State Security Agency has, for example. How do we capacitate the police, etc. And so they are saying 1 year later that there are little things in place. They talk about agreements with the banking sector, for example, the mining councils, for example. They also talk about the fact that, when you have copycat initiatives, efforts to shut down the country, when you have protests, illegal roadblocks in Mpumalanga, police are now acting compared to a year ago where there was no action. So they're claiming that as victory. We're obviously going to hear from the security cluster this morning. We want to know what has happened a year later. More importantly, what's worrying for me is that, police officials, intelligence officials, crime intelligence officials who were responsible during this time have not been taken any, there has been no consequence for them. And the reason why there has been no consequence for them, because they're pointing the finger to their political heads. because there's been no consequences for the political heads at the time. And so, 1 year later, families are still grieving their loved ones, Michelle, and still very little conclusive answers.
Yeah. It's devastating, isn't it? Because that's what you want in the wake of what was a devastating event in our country's history. 50 billion rand wiped off our economy. That number is likely higher than the official figures that we're seeing. As you say, more than 300 people having lost their lives as a result of the riots. President Cyril Ramaphosa had that one thing to say in his State of the Nation address, that yes, Cabinet does take responsibility. But insofar as real action is concerned, holding those accountable to account, that's not happened. Will it happen in future, 1 year later? Is it too late?
There's two appointments that the presidency points to as, key, decisions by the president in an effort to clean up the state security apparatus. One is the appointment of General Fani Masimola as the police commissioner, and the second is the appointment of Thembisa Majola as the Director General of the State Security Agency. And the point is that, we've learned from past experiences and other big appointments that the president made that appointing one person in the top echelon of an institution is not enough to fix the brokenness of these state institutions. The president has his own report that he commissioned in terms of the State Security Agency, the Sydney Mfumaji report of 2018. He has the Professor Sihle Afrika report. He now has the Zondo report that went very hard on institutions like the State Security Agency. And it's up to him. If anyone has to act, it's him. The presidency will say to you that yes, there has been meetings of the National Security Council, a body that the president set up but was defunct until day 5 of the unrest, that they are now meeting every 2 days. But it's important, to realize that, symbolic stuff that should have been happening anyways, doesn't fix your immediate problems. You still have threats. You still have people emboldened in their pursuit of violence and to instigate mass mobilization. And so the real issue now is political willingness. Because, Michelle, we must not forget the finding by Professor Sihle Afrika and the concession by senior leaders of the ANC that ANC factionalism spilled over into the state and affected governance and affected the situation, what we saw last July.
Qaanitah, the issue of holding those accountable to account, you talked about 3 people having been arrested in the wake of what happened in KZN and parts of Joburg in July of last year. What about the masterminds, those who, as you just said, were stoking the fires of what eventually unfolded on the streets of those 2 provinces?
You remember, Michelle, we did not say, it was the Minister of Police himself that said government has its eye on 12 instigators, and that number was increased to 18. Over the months, we've come to realize that was not based on any scientific information or some real forensic probing by the police or by the State Security Agency. It was, in fact, a member of the public that WhatsApped the minister a list of people that he thought, and yes, there's been arrests in terms of instigation, low-lying arrests, people who sent voice notes, people who tweeted things, but no real, because at the end of the day, if you want to go into who are the masterminds, you'd have to look very closely at the African National Congress, because let us not forget and let us not be bogged down on whether this was an insurrection or not an insurrection, but let us not forget that it was parts of the African National Congress weaponizing their own failures to try to instigate mass unrest for a selfish political motive, which is the former President Jacob Zuma and those around him who face legal or imminent charges. And so there's that part of it. It's the political willingness in the absence of it all. You remember the new ID head, Andrew Johnson, saying, it's very difficult to prove that someone, is this mastermind of this big, and you have to just prosecute people on individual crimes. But then you had the report by Sihle Afrika who says there has to be some treason charges. There has to be some treason charges.
Certainly. Qaanitah Hunter, let me thank you for your time this morning, author and political editor for News 24, as we continue to reflect on those 8 days in July, now 1 year later. Thanks very much indeed.